and from the rays of the One Light, weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. This week's topic, reason versus intuition. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Jesus, when addressing his critics, appealed to reason and common sense. In his training of the disciples, however, he, like all great masters, encouraged them the development of a higher faculty, soul intuition. For it is only by intuition that spiritual perceptions are achieved. In chapter 16 of the Gospel of St. Matthew, we find Jesus drawing on the intuition of his disciples by asking them who they thought he was in reality. They immediately understood that what he wanted from them was a subtle answer, not some obvious reply based on his nationality, sex, and the like. Peter it was, at last, who understood and answered the question on its intended level, the spiritual. "Thou art the Christ," he said, "the Son of the living God." And Jesus turned to him, saying, "Blessed art thou, Simon, son of Jonah, for not by human nature was this truth revealed to thee, but by my heavenly Father. And I tell thee this also, thou art Peter, which is to say, a rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and never will the powers of darkness overwhelm it." Jesus was pleased with his disciple for relating to the question on its deepest level. Reason could not have given Peter that answer. The answer came through the faculty of soul intuition, and proved him thereby to be a spiritually advanced disciple. It was his intuitive perception, that insight which cannot be shaken by tempest of reasonable doubt, that Jesus praised in referring to him as a rock. The church, he referred to next, was the edifice of cosmic consciousness. Any outward church institution would have to depend, as in fact the Christian churches have always done, on the level of understanding of its individual leaders and members. Peter's intuitive perceptions could never have been passed on to an outward succession of prelates. Clarity comes by direct soul perception. Confusion results from excessive dependence on reason as the guide to understanding. As the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita states, when your intellect, at present confused by the diversity of teaching in the scriptures, becomes steadfast in the ecstasy of deep meditation, then you will achieve final union with God. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om. Now, there's several themes in these readings that we'll be discussing today. And the first is willpower, and how it works, and sometimes how it doesn't work. In other words, if our willpower isn't that strong, sometimes we struggle a bit. But nonetheless, if we can find a way to unite our will with the divine will, then we have, of course, the power of the divine will making things happen through us. Not us doing it, but the divine will doing it. The other thing that struck me in this reading is the fact that when Jesus tells Peter that he is a rock, and upon this rock he will build the church. So often, even though in this reading it tells us the rest of the story, which is that church is cosmic consciousness, sometimes we forget that we too are Peter. We too can have the cosmic consciousness within ourselves. In fact, we already do. It's just how well do we know it? And can we develop the soul intuition that will allow us to perceive the living Son of God, thou art the Christ, and to know that that is indeed the reality that we can live in, and that is the highest reality for our own souls. And it always helps to remember the rest of this, because as life goes on and we live through times that are challenging, Jesus promises, I will build my church, and never will the powers of darkness overwhelm it. Now that can be taken in a very personal way. Never will the powers of darkness overcome us, individually and collectively. And there's times in our lives where sometimes it's a struggle. Sometimes our willpower is not enough to overcome the challenges that we face. Sometimes it seems like no matter how hard we try and how many times we roust ourselves from whatever it is that's belaying us, or making our mind go in circles or preventing us to find our peace of mind. Little Tasmanian devils of doubt and fear, and etc., running around up there and spinning and throwing up dust. And there we are doing our best to try to calm our minds and to open our hearts and to feel peace inside. And then, of course, not only do we have our own thoughts and actions that we need to address and to work with and to work through, but we also have aspects of the world around us, the consciousness of the world around us and the challenges that we face as a result of that. Recently, there was a discussion that was had by a group of friends, and we were talking about willpower as part of it, but also the power of the astrological bangle. And I think it was from the autobiography of a yogi. Some of you guys will remember the name of the chapter, but I think it was Outwitting the Stars. And in this discussion, partly, the question was, well, do we really need bangles? And what is this mystical bangle all about? And if we just apply our willpower hard enough and strong enough, won't we be able to overcome whatever it is that's facing us? And of course, there's validity to both points. On the other hand, one of the things that we came to the conclusion of is, you know what? We need all the help we can get. And so why not, if for some reason you need to have, a bangle, or you feel inspired to have a bangle. And the guru, of course, received one and offered them to his disciples in order to be another tool in the tool chest to help us along our way. And so we have to remember that, we put out our own willpower and we do the best that we can. And sometimes we succeed and sometimes we don't. But the only time that we truly fail is when we stop trying. When we stop trying. And one of the other readings here that I found amusing, I think it might be a good word, because it's so sweet that Krishna thinks that perhaps the only thing that our intellect is confused by is the diversity of teaching in the scriptures. I wish that was the case, that the only thing that confused my intellect was trying to understand the scriptures and to live by them. But frankly, there's so many other things in the world that cause confusion and cause self-doubt, etc. And it's not always on the highest level, but nonetheless, it's real to us and we need to overcome it. And when I read statements like this from Krishna, I always go back to another part of the Bhagavad Gita. And I'm not going to be able to paraphrase or tell you the whole of the passage, but in essence, Krishna is telling the devotee to cling to God, cling to me, steadfastly worship me, offer me your devotion, offer me your service. And then it concludes with a sweet statement that says, and if in these attempts, your faint heart fails, offer to me your failure. Give me your failure. Now, there's times when we're soaring in God's light and we just feel the support and we see examples all around us of the presence of God and the presence of the divine. And other times, literally, no matter how hard you're looking, all you can experience and see is your own pain, your own sorrow, your own confusion. And yet, if you continue, even in that level of despair, to give that to God, you're sincerely making your very best effort in that moment to be attuned to the light. There's a story that I've read over the years, and it's one of those classic stories of darkness versus light. And as I told you, Christ promised that darkness will never overwhelm. You will always have the light with you. And this story is an ancient, it's a story that it's a fictional story, and yet it's so based on very deep truths. And there comes a point in this story where two characters are having a conversation. And previous to this conversation, they had been on a great quest, because of course you have to have a quest and you have to have a journey. And in this scenario, there is a wizened, battle-hardened warrior. He grew up in a country that had never known peace. And he, was a leader of his people, and he had fought many, many campaigns and fought them, to the last person, trying to save his people, give them time to escape from whatever situation was confronting them. And so he had lots of experience in the battle against the darkness. And the person he was speaking to was a young man. And this young man had grown up in a country that had never known anything except peace. That the forces of darkness were fables and fairy tales and scary things to tell your children so that they would behave, because they had never had the experience of any of these hardships. And in this quest, these two characters were in search of what they called the Horn of Valere. And it had supernatural powers. And it had the power of soul redemption. And it had the power to call to one the heroes, the great heroes of all the previous ages, to come fight the battle on their side. And the grizzled warrior, because of his many decades of fighting against the darkness, at one point, apparently he gave in to the darkness. He despaired and was prompted to do something, a little thing, that he knew in his heart was not the best thing to do. And he thought, well, it's such a little thing, why should it cause any trouble? And because he was unsure that the light would prevail, that the fight would be won, he gave in. And again, momentarily. And events unfold, and obviously something dire did happen to his people as a result of his choice. And yet when he was given the opportunity to search for and to find and retrieve this Horn of Valere, he led the pursuit. And part of his company was this young man from a different era, from a different place, from a different perspective altogether. Ultimately, they recover it. And yet, in the midst of this situation, it became obvious that they weren't going to be able to get away from the other forces, the opposing forces. So they split up the group. And the young man gave the horn to his friends and said, "Get this to where it needs to go." Because in the process of leaving that town after they had secured this precious artifact, he saw from a distance a friend from his little village, and she had been captured by the enemy. And there was no way he was going to just leave her behind without trying. He against this mighty army, but nonetheless he felt that it was only right for him to try. And the grizzled warrior was going, "Well, you can't do that. It's more important that we make sure that, mankind's salvation is taken care of. It needs to be, secured." And the young man says, "Well, my friends are going to take care of that. Meanwhile, if I made the choice to abandon my friend without trying, then I would condemn myself for eternity for my actions and my choice." And the grizzled warrior looked at him in astonishment because he'd never thought about his own salvation in that perspective before. And he at that point confessed what it was that he had done to this young man. And of course, the young man was taken aback that this individual whom he had come and learned to respect and love and to appreciate his valor and his wisdom and his experience, and yet he had compassion for the individual. And the older man was essentially asking the question, how do I reach salvation? If I can no longer have this horn of Valeri, which will free my soul, what other options do I have? An excellent question. And yet at the same time, we all know that at some point, like the choir sang today, we must all go on alone. We must stand on our own 2 feet in order to be able to find God. And we must do what we feel is right, regardless of what we think might or might not be the circumstances. And that was a revelation to this older man. And he realized that there are sometimes higher callings. And the young man tells him, he says, I think that if you want to no longer walk in ignorance and darkness, all you need to do is turn to the light. All you need to do is do a different decision to turn to the light. And every time you have a choice, do your best to turn to the light. And I think that's the only way that light will, that you can stay in the light and the darkness will never overcome you. And so if you make a mistake and you fall a little bit, turn to the light. Do your best. Get yourself up, dust yourself off, try yet again. No matter how dire you think your mistake was. The only way out of this for a devotee is to try and try and try again. And so it's a wonderful reminder to each of us, regardless of whether we're soaring in God's bliss at the moment and we're living in an incredible flow of joy, or whether on our particular part of the journey of the spiritual path, seems like every time we try something, our willpower fails. Or all we see is mistake after mistake after mistake. And we're kind of, desperate in order to be able to change what seems to be happening. And all of our best efforts just aren't quite enough. Failure might be too hard of a word. Maybe we could just say, it could have been better. And that's a kind and compassionate way of looking at it. It could have been better. And so we keep trying. And, the world itself, well, it has its own consciousness and its own opportunities for spiritual growth. And I came across a couple of things. This was on YouTube. I was trying to get my mind out of the thoughts and the whirlwinds and daredevils that were running around in there. And I just needed to step back a little bit. I was looking for things to help me laugh, because laughter, of course, is great medicine for whatever it is that ails us. And I came across a story from a young man, a teenage boy, from Ukraine. He was a refugee. And he and his family had fled to Hungary. And he was at a train station in Hungary. And as many of you, if you've been paying attention to the news, are aware of, many of these refugees literally just have whatever they can carry with them. And of course, potentially family members, or I should say more clearly, some of their family members, others whom may be left behind. And this young man brought his guitar. And the individuals, the reporters, saw him from across the room. And he was playing the guitar, and he was surrounded by a bunch of little children. And then, the children were there, and then their parents, and then their grandparents. And, he sang songs to the kids, and the songs the children sang with him. And sometimes he would do a more patriotic song that might stir the hearts of the adults. But nonetheless, he was offering that as a gift of upliftment, of encouragement to the folks who were sitting relatively safe at the moment, but certainly their lives have been turned upside down. No idea what's going to happen in the next moment. But his choice was to offer upliftment and hope and joy and a moment of respite in the midst of whatever else was going on. And the reporters asked to interview him. And, they said, well, why did you bring your guitar? And he explained, his reasons, because he wanted to be and to encourage. And it brought him such joy to play and to sing. And he couldn't consider life without having that as a part of his possibilities. And as they were speaking, over the loudspeaker at the train station came an announcement. And understandably, the young man paused to hear what the announcement was. And over the loudspeaker, there's this statement: "We have found a babushka. If you have lost your babushka, please come to the information desk." And of course, babushka, grandmother. And this big grin appeared on this young man's face. And he started to chuckle, and he shared a laugh with the reporter. Because the absurdity of, in this situation, the announcement says, "Hey, we have a missing babushka. We found her. Come get her." And it was lighthearted and sweet, because we know that at least for that babushka, it was likely to have a positive outcome in that moment. In other words, she was very much likely to be reunited with her family or whoever she was traveling with. But nothing was said about all the other babushkas left behind, or other family members who were choosing their own dharma, figuring out how they could be instruments of the light to fight the darkness in the very, very many ways that they can. And here is this young man, and I'm sure his family members, some of them, are, doing what they can do, staying behind, hoping to offer to him and his generation that he represents an opportunity for greater freedom and self-expression. And we have to remember that we can share in that upliftment, in that fight, by simply being instruments of light ourselves. And no matter whether we feel we can help directly or not, remember that the great ones can. God and Guru are right there trying to help everyone. And all we can do is do our best to cooperate with that flow as we feel inspired. I'm going to close with one more story. And this is a story of a young woman. And I don't know how long ago this happened. It was an episode of America's Got Talent. And so she was a young woman who was going to compete in this particular show. And she came out and stood in front of the audience and in front of the judges. And she did something unusual, immediately unusual. She took off her shoes. And she stood in her stocking feet on the stage. Well, she also had someone else come up and stand next to where the judges were. And so the judges welcomed her and asked her name. And she told them. And they said, well, can you tell us about, the woman standing next to us? And she says, well, she's my interpreter. And, that gave the judges and the audience a bit of a pause. And they said, well, tell us why you're standing, why you took your shoes off. She says, well, I can feel the vibration of the music. And behind her, there were some instruments that were going to accompany her. She had a little ukulele. And they said, so you're going to sing a song? And she said, yes, I'm going to sing a song. And she proceeded to do so. And it was, she was wonderful. It was an absolutely wonderful song, and it was a song that she wrote herself. And it was the journey of her story, because when she was 18 years old, she wanted to become a singer. And so she had enrolled in a school for the arts in order to be able to learn more about how to do that. And she came down with an ear infection, and it went to both ears. And for whatever reason, she lost hearing in both ears, was completely deaf. And yet, she refused to give up on her dream of sharing music with others. And so her song was a song of that story, and of the trials and the challenges and the effort to just try. And one of the things that she shared with the audience was just a heartbreaking story, because she realized, given whatever prognosis that she had been given by the doctors, she was brokenhearted that she would never be able to hear her father's voice again. And that was the low moment for her, that she would never be able to hear his voice. And yet, she persevered. And she said, I chose to engage the gifts I was given. I was given the gift of perfect pitch. And I still have muscle memory of how to sing, the dynamics of how to sing. And so she sang this incredible, bittersweet song of her journey and of her triumph and of the willpower required to share that with the world. And the audience, of course, was transfixed by her story. At first they thought she was kind of weird and what's going on here. And then when she started to tell them what, she was going to do, they started to pay a little more attention. And partway through her performance, the audience was clapping. And then they realized that, well, she may be able to see them, that they were clapping, that she wouldn't be able to hear them clap. And they noticed that the interpreter was going like this, hands in the air. And they intuited that this means, in sign language, something along the lines of applause and approval. And they stood as one, this audience stood as one, and began, at the conclusion of her song, just sending her silent praise and silent appreciation. Because they, like the judges who were unaccustomedly silent after her performance, they were just stunned to silence by the beauty that she shared. And they had recognized that not only had they observed someone offering the gift of song and doing it in an amazing and beautiful way, but they had witnessed an individual soul being undaunted by the various challenges that she has faced, and choosing to follow her inspiration to do what she thought was her, given destiny, to share her perfect pitch, to share the love of song with all. And no matter what it was that she had to face, she went on. And so they were honoring not only her song, but the soul inspiration, the demonstration of the highest that we're capable of. Sometimes we just think we're too small. We don't remember that with God all is possible. And every once in a while, someone comes along and helps us all to remember that we are children of God, and with God, nothing is impossible. God bless you.